So, thank you all. That's fantastic. So we heard three sort of different approaches to this changing world that we live in, and three different approaches to how we might change the way we think. So we heard about kind of changing the way we tell stories. We heard about changing how we think about what our career is all about, and we heard about changing our goals and our kind of relationships with audiences. And any thoughts from any of you of how those work together? Are they kind of mutually exclusive kinds of approaches, or is there any kind of synergy? What can we kind of take away from any of that? A question I do not have an answer to, so I hope that you do.
Okay.
Well, you look like you were going to say something.
Well, I was just struck by the notion of precarity, and really hearing about how everybody is, especially in the United States, is their own. You're basically a freelancer, and you're no longer taken care of by your employer. It seems to tie in a lot with the reality that we saw at the Christian Science Monitor, which was this acceptance of the only way we're going to survive is by breaking down this wall that's been around for almost 100 years, where the business side does their own thing and the journalists do their own thing, and now it's like, we know that our job survival depends on whether we're going to generate revenue, so we're going to get involved in that process, and we're not going to be afraid to talk about it anymore.
I can just echo that, particularly in the earlier period, it was very exciting to do these interviews in those countries, because I also, through the journalist, I saw this happening in news organizations in Europe as well, like that the wall was falling sort of out of it was felt out of necessity. Like young journalists who were telling me that they would like voluntarily sit in on meetings with advertising and the business side, and their older colleagues thought that they were crazy and that they shouldn't do that. But that was, again, it was another way of being entrepreneurial. I better learn something about the business side too. So.
One implication I'd just add to this is I think, even though this seemed like a huge downer in a lot of ways, but I think there's something to be said for smaller organizations, but maybe more of them. And I do think we're in a period right now where, as metro dailies, particularly those owned by venture capital, are really struggling. I think you could go into Denver as a young entrepreneur and you would have a lot less, overhead, but you could really make a go of it. Maybe especially now in 2018. So I think, that isn't necessarily an easy thing to do, obviously, but I think there is some opportunity here, in knowing what you want to be and going for it.
I actually was going to ask the two of you to fight it out between precarity and entrepreneurialism, because I'm going to have some different views.
Yeah,
but
could be.
Maybe we'll come back to that. But Josh, do you have a question?
Sure. Yeah, it's a question for Henrik. I'm curious, in your cross-country examinations of this. I assume that in the different countries that you're looking at, there are different levels of support for state-backed media.
Sure, yeah.
And I'm wondering if you saw any sort of correlation between the role, the strength, the relative funding of the BBC or the CBC or whatever the equivalent would be in each country, and the degree to which precarity was a looming force in the lives of journalists there.
I think for journalism as an institution in general, there's no doubt that state public service broadcasting plays a hugely important role, and indeed that's the norm in many countries, except here. But in terms of shielding people from precarity, Swedish national television, for example, they're a shitty employer. They don't hire people permanently. They only hire people on short-term contracts, and they've been doing this for decades. BBC, somewhat similar, actually. So they're not. Yeah, they're doing other things, and I could point you to my book, News Workers, Comparing Journalists in 6 European Countries, out now from Bloomsbury. They play other important roles, particularly at that earlier, it was public service that was at the forefront of digital innovation. That might not be the case anymore, but they were sort of doing the new stuff. But that doesn't have any bearing on precarity, I don't think.
John, you had some interesting points in your paper about how the different approaches to thinking about a story also meant different approaches to sources, different approaches to audiences. That seems like a fairly significant shift in how journalists are thinking about how they go about constructing something that they're going to put out to their readers. Is that, what kinds of impacts did that have on the ultimate story that got told?
Well, the main difference I found was that actually those newsmakers, those very classic image of journalists working on daily stories and under pressure, that he was not very audience-oriented. He departed from his own idea of what the story has to be, and that when those storytellers, journalists with a lot more time to write stories, they were a lot more, well, I would not say audience-oriented, but a lot more source-oriented in that sense that they were more, like I said, they were not interviewing sources, but they were interviewing people. They were listening to people. I think you need both kinds of journalism. If you have to speak with powerful politicians, you have to be a newsmaker, I think. But if you have to speak with people in your community, with ordinary people, then, well, the attitude of the storyteller may be a better idea, I think, than instead of departing from, okay, I want to make a story about Trump voters, and I already known what the story will be, and just interviewing, picking quotes to fill in your story.
Yeah, something we actually haven't talked a lot about, I think, in this conference is source. We've talked a lot about audience relationships, but not actually a lot about source relationships. It's very interesting. I really recommend the paper, how stories get constructed. Good. I think I will. I don't know if is Rosenthal shouting at me, or can we just have the? I really would like to hear Carrie, because Carrie studies a lot of that and teaches a lot about entrepreneurialism. And we've kind of got two very different approaches to where journalists might be heading with that idea of, I'm just going to go it alone. And I don't know if you two want to argue about this a little bit in public.
Arguing is fun. You can go first.
I don't. It really are. They are like two sides of the same phenomenon. Of course it's stressful. Of course it's like a huge pressure. But like if you make your startup or your project work, then that's like incredibly rewarding, of course. Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting that we're now seeing maybe in scholarship a bit more critical takes on entrepreneurship. Tamara Witschke and her colleagues in the Netherlands are coming out with a paper at a conference in a couple of months, which is about sort of journalistic startups and this long hours culture, like that you have to work all the time. And what does that mean for women, particularly? Like a lot of these issues are gendered, actually. And class-based, just so. So I think you need to look at sort of both of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. I mean, I think, entrepreneurship is difficult, and having that kind of backing of a larger institution with a lot of resources behind you is, a really significant thing. But, I mean, I do think there is increasingly opportunities to serve people that are not being served, and who maybe even, let's remember, even in the days when newspapers were printing money, we were not really serving a lot of low-income, communities, a lot of minority communities. I mean, I think there is opportunity to deliver information to those people that we've maybe neglected. And I think, my parents are not journalists. They live in Milwaukee, now owned by Gannett. I mean, they can see that paper is very thin, and they're starting to ask questions and saying, what is going on here? I think that does create an opportunity to, serve that market. But do I think that's easy, or that, everyone can just do it, or that there's no issues with things like salary and health benefits? No. But I just do think there's some, if we learn a little bit more about, some of the business skills, or even, Texas Tribune skills about supporting a nonprofit, maybe, we can have some success.
All right, we have to end there. Thank you to our four wonderful scholars. Thanks to you. And